Hello, welcome to Technology Trends, a television program about ancient wisdom and new technology. I'm your host, Patrick Bailey. Our show today is entitled Astro-Theology and Sidereal Mythology. And we have with us as our special guest, once again, Michael Tsarion from the Bay Area. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Patrick. Nice to be back.
And in order to get involved with astro-theology or sidereal mythology, perhaps we should have an introduction as how did you get into this and a summary of your background.
Well, it connects to what we spoke about on the first program when we were here talking about divination and the tarot and astrology. On part of my life that I spent studying this in Ireland, I found out that mere aesthetic appreciation of the tarot, for instance, the beautiful imagery on the cards, I found out that most of the books that you find conventionally did not explain the deep symbolism of the cards. So I spent a lot of years trying to research and coming up empty to what the deeper arcane mysteries of the tarot were. And of course in Ireland, literature on any metaphysical subjects is very scant indeed. And basically, to cut a long story short, what happened was that I had came across the work of Jordan Maxwell, who is the leading authority in the world on the subject of astro-theology. And his information, basically his approach to ancient theology, ancient symbolism, started giving me the answers. So one of the first things that I did when I arrived in California was to try and make contact with him, and I succeeded. And I'm glad to say I've been working with him quite closely on this subject. And both he and I are trying to bring back this gnosis into Western society, because it does open a lot of doors, and it shines light on many things in our society that are, sort of shielded or guarded, or that we just have not been looking at clearly,
Okay, so it's the idea of looking into what the symbols mean, the knowledge of symbols, and the impact they may have on our subconscious, actually.
Yeah, definitely, because we are surrounded by symbols, not only on television and in billboards and magazines, but now even on the data space with a computer.
Mm-hmm.
And when you watch a movie, that's what you're watching. You're going there to, enjoy the symbolic enrichment of your consciousness. So symbols are all around us, and we are basically in the West symbol illiterate. And even though people like Joseph Campbell and others have talked extensively about trying to get savvy about what certain symbols mean, we're still in a situation where we are illiterate when it comes to that kind of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So part of my work is to show people what the symbols mean, how they can use them, even for empowerment in their own lives, because they are a means of communication, but they tend to communicate to our subconscious minds.
Subconscious.
Yeah, to our subconscious. And you've had specialists in this country. I mean, this is a very well-researched field. It's just that astro-theology specifically has not come to light because, as Jordan Maxwell has pointed out several times, it lays bare the occult roots of both religion and government. And people find that very hard to understand. They think it's very controversial. So, you'll find anecdotal references. Astro-theology, of course, means the religion of the stars. It means it is a theology. In fact, it is the theology that undergirds all of Judeo-Christianity and all of the other ologies and theologies that we have. But because it does lay bare the fact that even the roots of politics and the roots of government are occult, this is why other people will deal with it anecdotally. But he and I are of the belief now that we're in the 21st century, and the people are ready to hear this information, and they certainly are. I teach this throughout, Europe and also here, and people are certainly very ready to hear about this information. The point being that we've been told by our politicians that the need to have knowledge is on a need-to-know basis, with the idea that we don't need to know. So both Jordan and I say, well, that has to change, and people do need to know, and this is a subject that its time has come.
You mentioned earlier that the symbology that began your quest began with the tarot cards.
Yes, yeah.
And the tarot cards were the deck of 78 cards that preceded the normal bridge deck that we have today.
Definitely, yeah.
And a lot of those cards were the major arcana?
Yes, exactly. There's three decks, and they're extremely symbolically rich. And many people have questioned and pontificated on their various meanings. Ultimately, they came from Egypt, is what I discovered. But as I said, most of the usual, writings that you would read or the research, it wasn't really going into great depth. Mm-hmm. Now, astro-theology, sidereal mythology, is a hermeneutic that you can use it to many subjects, not just to the divination arts, but right across the board, to corporate symbolism, to the media. And as you know, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, many of these people have very rich symbolic movies with many arcane theological themes.
Yeah.
So this is not something that's just dated. This has a great meaning for our age. And I hear constantly, that's why I like to be on programs like this, to show people that even in a place like the Bay Area, which is cutting edge, techno, cutting edge science, what would any of this have of importance? Well, the fact is that a lot of people, even though they do work in those fields, they haven't forgot about their mental and spiritual development. In the Bay Area, there's a very large community of people who are not neglecting their religious and their theological duty and their spiritual enrichment, and this is where this comes in.
Okay.
And too often, I think that America throughout the world has been called a place of no culture, and or a cultureless kind of place. So I think I look at myself and people who do this kind of work as the people who are bringing culture to the country, and it's a specifically American kind of way. So I find that a lot of people are very interested in it. They love the material, and it's very enriching all around.
Okay, just as a starting off place, most of our viewers are probably interested in constellations in the sky, and the night sky symbology, which the movie Stargate made very popular on that big, the big Stargate wheel.
Yeah.
So that might be, what would you call that? Sidereal mythology or astro-theology symbols.
Oh yeah, if people would start to be aware of how much constellational, what we call, another word to use is stellar or Sabian. The astrologers use the word Sabian or stellar or sidereal, or there's different phrases that talk about symbols of the constellations in the zodiac. Our society is permeated by these symbols. You find them in the movie business, you find them on product logos, on fashion designs, on cosmetics, you find them on sports decals. We give children stars in school. Yeah. Many of our government, civic, state buildings feature enormous mosaics. All across the Western world, you'll find beautiful buildings. In fact, our whole cities are laid out. The whole of Washington D.C., for instance. Not a lot of people know that there's more zodiacs, carvings and murals of zodiacs. There's 22 of them in Washington, D.C. That's more than any other place in the entire world. And the entire city itself is laid out based on Masonic or, sidereal geometry. Mm-hmm. So this is very much at the heart of America. It's being used a lot. And it's time for the ordinary person to wake up and realize that this is taking place and to get symbol literate.
Okay, well, we'll be getting into a lot of the details of this later on. Mm-hmm. What is it about the role that these symbols, like the stars, play in society?
Right, again...
Subliminal, subconscious?
Yes, they do. They're being... we are being affected by them. Because remember, when we talk about, say, Egypt even talk about Egypt itself, we're talking about an immense period of time there. Now, we are not just a short-term memory people. We have a genetic, racial memory within us. So all that our forefathers did before, all that our peers, our ancestors were doing for countless millennia is still in our DNA. It's still in our racial memory. So then when certain sidereal symbols, Friedrich Nietzsche, for instance, the German philosopher, he said, as long as you're committed to the idea that the stars are merely something above your head, you will lack the eye of knowledge and never know wisdom. So do we put this down as another one of his eccentric statements? No. Actually, I found out that the stars are, in fact, all around us. As I said, we find them in hundreds of different areas. And when they're being used, and we're not consciously aware of them, they have an effect because they're tapping in. They elicit responses, from our emotional, libidinous self. And this can sometimes be to our detriment. For instance, what is the greatest star out there is the sun. Right. So people might want to look around and just see how commonly the symbol of the sun is used on logos and in perspex, murals and cut into logos and designs. Just that one symbol, or the symbol for Saturn, for instance, the planet Saturn. We'll maybe get into some examples in a minute, but it's incredible how many Sabian symbols are used all throughout society, and basically we in the Western world pay them no mind, but they are having a deep effect on our racial memory, and we are actually being manipulated by symbols in society, and you can say that subliminally as well. Yeah.
We'll be seeing that in this program.
Yeah, we will definitely be looking into some of the usages.
Okay, some of the material that we're going to cover will seem very controversial to some people, and the idea that an image can cause an unconscious reaction, people won't believe that. So have you really found examples of this?
Yeah, my approach is very grassroots, so I use a lot of displays and a lot of examples. Mm-hmm. But sure, when you bring any new symbol or new subject along to people, they're going to head scratch and say, what's the point of all of this, and where does it really fit into my life, But I like to repeat what Voltaire, the French writer, he said, man will cease to commit atrocities when he ceases to believe absurdities. Now, as I said, that Christianity and many of the theologies and beliefs that we have today are founded upon occult roots coming out of the ancient pagan world. And we are oblivious to what those are, but we may be oblivious to it. The people within the cabals of learning and the peoples within the advertising business and those within theology, they are not. You know, people who run for the priest-archy take a 7-year degree. 7 years, they must be learning something all of that time, and they are. They're learning about the whole reservoir of knowledge that they know about. And what we get from the pulpit, what we have to understand is that what we get from the pulpit is not theology, it's propaganda. Theology is something different. Theology, or astro-theology, is the religion of the heavens, it's the religion of the stars, it is the oldest religion, going back to the period, the golden age of Egypt, and what we call the stellar cult. Because, Patrick, a lot of people are not familiar in daily society today that in the ancient world, in the time BC, there was at least 7 great cults of power in the ancient world, and 4 of those cults were of extreme great power. And we can actually take a look at the screen. I have a couple of slides that will bring this out. That one of the most powerful cults of the ancient world, there was 4 of them. One was called the Stellar cult, and this was lasted for many millennia, and it had to do with priests and priestesses, our ancestors, who worshiped God through the stars, and they were astrologers. This is where our astrology and our mathematics comes to us. Another one of the powerful cults was called the Lunar cult, and the Lunar cult worshipped the stars, but they emphasized the moon. Then we have the famous Saturnian cult, or the cult of the planet Saturn. And many of our things today come out of this worship of the planet Saturn. Astrologers know that the planet Saturn, for instance, is related to the sign of Capricorn, and therefore it's related to the color black. And that is why judges and theologians and rabbis and even the oral Puritans, and you'll see the graduates wearing the long black robes. Jordan Maxwell has pointed out several times that this has to do with the Saturnalian cult. It's a principle that we see symbols all running through society. But in those days of the Saturnalian cult, God wasn't called Saturn, he was called El, or Elohim. And this word El permeates all of our society. I don't know if you can see clearly on the screen there, but Saturn was also worshipped, or El was worshipped. And when a person was then taken up to be part of El, or to be one with El, they were called an elite, or a person who was an elite, yeah, or an elder, you see, or one of the elect. We still even use the word elect today in politics, you see, so it has the El word root. You know, they say that the women, for instance, were told that they should obey their god Saturn and listen to Saturn, or listen to El, so they were told to wear the ear rings. So this is where the idea of the ring comes from. And then if you got married, you see, you were married under the god Saturn, so you wore the wedding ring. So a lot of symbols that we use in society come from these particular cults, and we are not in any way knowledgeable about what this is. And see if we have some more images of this. Yeah, the crown. Kings were being crowned under Saturn, of course. So the idea was where they would wear a circlet on their heads that then became known as the crown, which is a ring, you see, on the head. And in fact, the word crown comes from the Greek version of Saturn, which is Kronos. We get our word crown from one of the names of Saturn. You have often seen from picture books the images of the god or the goddess or the priestess or even the magician standing in the circle. You know, people think of this quaint image of the magician standing in his circle with the planetary symbols. The idea of the ring, again, comes from the planet Saturn. We often see religious icons and religious art where they show the halo around the head, and people have debated where does this image come from. It comes from 2 symbols that used to be part of the solar cult when the sun or the light of illumination was around the head. But the ring, the idea again of the ring, comes down from the cult of Saturn. This is why monks, for instance, would often shave their head at the top, and you know, in the sign of a ring. This all goes back to a particular cult that we in the Western world have heard very little about. And we also find that the Pope and the Hebrews wear the yarmulke, which is a round circlet, a hat that they will wear. This also goes from this. And that's why Hebrews, in fact, talking about the Israelites, the Jews will worship on Saturn's day, or Saturday, whereas the Christians, who are more of a solar cult, the solar cult being another powerful cult, they worship on the sun's day, or Sunday. So this is where these symbols arise. Now the lunar cult was a very powerful cult of the ancient world. And it was a kindred, it was part of the stellar cult. But again, the emphasis was on the moon. And this is where, when we look back in the history books, especially in Egypt, we see the goddesses often wearing the crescent or the lunar horns. You know, in Native Americans, you often have the shamans wearing the horns, the buffalo horns, and talking about many moons. You know, because different parts of the world, you could be kindred with one another, not by blood or by race or by culture, but you could be kindred if you were of the same cult. And this had to do with the moon. And the unicorn is also an image that comes down to us from those times, because the unicorn is the ancient symbol of Cancer, the sign of Cancer in astrology, which is ruled by the moon. So a lot of people who think, if anyone is listening to this and they are Cancer, they probably think their symbol is the crab. Well, that's not. That's a very modern symbol. Before that, the pale white unicorn, which you still see used on royal heraldry, for instance, actually represents the moon. And the lion on the other side of the royal heraldry, that represents the sun, or the house of Leo. So again, even in heraldry and royalty and many insignias all over society, we keep seeing these what we call Sabian or stellar symbolisms coming out of astrology and astromancy. And here again is the crescent moon with a face on it, coming from a particular period, a particular time in history, when the moon was seminal and was worshipped by ancient people. And here on the tarot cards, this is how I actually partly got into this subject. I noticed these symbols turning up on tarot cards. Here's a card called the High Priestess, and she's actually sitting on a throne, and in front of her is the crescent moon. You know, so I would ask myself, what on earth do these enigmatic symbols mean? You know, where do they come from, and so on. And then in Grecian times, we get the priestess idea. You see, as these different cults supplanted one another, they would borrow a lot of the symbolism and iconography from one another, and they would use it for their own devices. And in the previous cults, in the stellar cult, which is the earliest, and the lunar cult, which followed, women had positions of great authority. But in the Saturnian cult and the solar cult, they started to lose this authority, and that, in fact, in our times, we find that women were denied any kind of official office. Certainly, we're not allowed to be part of the religions or the priestarchy, and there's reasons for this. It has to do with political agendas of these cults passing from one to the other, and then trying to suppress the previous cults. And many euphemisms that you find in the Bible go back to this. Now, in the Grecian times, when these Egyptian myths started moving into the Grecian times, here's an image of Persephone, for instance, this slide, and we find a bit of both. The Greeks were on the twilight zone between the old Egyptian mythologies, which was very sacred, and then the debauched version that we find in Christianity. So in their mythologies, which we accept, you see, today, Greek mythology is acclaimed and books have been written, and yet nothing hardly is known about the Egyptian. We looked at that as if it's fantastic and not worthy of a lot of our concern. But what we don't realize is that the Greeks borrowed an awful lot from the Egyptians, if not everything. And when we look at their mythologies, we get this sort of half and half, where the mythology is still somewhat pure, but then a little bit corrupted as they try to interface it with their own agenda, you see. And then one of the things that you get is this degradation of the female. Now, I must point out that in Egypt, women had more rights than they've ever had before. And there was never a single case on record anywhere in Egypt of any form of religious intolerance. This has been documented, you see. And here's an interesting anecdote. All of the cults, you see, they happened to join together. At one point, they decided that rather than fighting one another, they should get together. And they did this, and it didn't happen overnight, of course. It happened quite slowly. But one of the reasons that they decided to get together was for power and for money. They were after the trade routes, and they were after the consciousness, the mind of human beings. They wanted to rule the consciousness of people, and they decided to pool their resources rather than always wasting resources fighting one another. And that's why today on money, the word money itself comes from Mon, which is the moon, because the lunar cult, many of the symbols that you find on money come down from the lunar cult, and one of them is the dollar sign. A lot of Americans, what they think is the dollar sign is an old symbol going back many, many thousands of years, and it relates to the goddess, the supreme goddess of the moon and of the lunar cult, who is called Isis. Now you spell Isis, I-S-I-S, and if you put those letters together in a designer fashion, you actually get the dollar sign, which, believe me, is not American. That sign goes back as a magical occult sigil many, many thousands of years.
It's a collapsed...
Yes,
pushing the letters together, ISIS, and you get the dollar sign.
You get the dollar sign.
I never saw that before. That's
these things have been hidden. Well, this is an example, as we were saying, about how symbols are used in this way, in case people, this is completely new to them. And you see, I must point out that if you actually look at the dollar bill, I mean, many people have a slant on what the symbols on the dollar bill mean and so on. Before you even get into that, just looking at the dollar bill, you'll find that all of the symbols of those 4 cults I just mentioned are on there. Okay, the pyramid is a symbol of the stellar cult, because they were the great architects and magicians, the ones who were really the keepers of the knowledge. The Bible refers to them as the Magi. Whenever you hear the term the Magi being used, it's a reference directly to the stellar cult. The eagle is a symbol of the solar cult. We're going to come to some images of the solar cult soon. But here's an interesting image, because we were talking there about the Renaissance and the Hellenistic and the Roman period. Here you have Moses, shown by Leonardo da Vinci, and this is Michelangelo's Moses. Michelangelo showed Moses with horns on his head, and people, have written on this and couldn't understand why this was done. Michelangelo and Leonardo and many of the people who were in Florence and Venice at that time were high initiates into these mysteries. And the reason why Michelangelo's Moses has these horns is again to represent that Moses was originally a hero or a deity from the lunar cult. The wearing of the crescent moon, which sometimes looks like horns, you see. That's why you'll see Diana or Artemis wearing the headdress of the crescent moon. This goes back to that. Many flags in the world will bear the crescent. Here's one that is of Islam. Islamic faith, another theology, another religion, has its roots in these great cults, the stellar and the lunar cult. So if people just open their eyes and do their homework, they're going to find that these symbols are on hundreds of areas, flags and heraldry. Whole cities are based on their symbolism. Remember in the Middle Ages, these beautiful illuminated tapestries showing look at the flags there. You have the female, you have the unicorn, you see you have the goddess, and then on the flags you have the crescent moons. In Christian art, you have the same idea of the Mother Mary, who again is a descendant of the lunar principle. They just basically borrowed this or appropriated it from a previous cult. And you see the large emphasis here on the crescent moon. And this is a concept that turns up extensively through religious art. Now, if you look at the stars above Mother Mary's head there are 12 stars. That's a direct relation to the zodiac, by the way.
The 12 constellations.
The 12, yes. The 12 constellations. Zodiac. Yeah. Here again, you find Mother Mary, more of a designer style, but definitely standing on the crescent moon. And people have been seeing this for years and never thought anything of it. Now, the stellar cult. The stellar cult, one of the great goddesses was called Isis, or Mat, or Nut. And when a pharaoh was buried, a principle that we have of burial in our society, in ancient times, they were so cognizant of the fact that when you died, you went back to the womb of the mother, that in sarcophagi, in this slide it will show you these 2 sarcophagi, on the inner side of the lid of all these sarcophagi, you will see a starry sky motif with the body of the goddess that is placed over the dead pharaoh, that he's returning. This is where our idea comes from, of being put into a box, is that you're really returning, to the goddess.
This is the image that's on the left.
Yeah, or the right. We basically came from a mother. You see, we came out of a womb, so the idea was that we go back to one after we pass on. And one of the earliest versions of the goddess from the lunar and the stellar cult was the goddess Mat, or Mayat. And this word actually gives rise to several other goddess motifs down through the centuries, and also a lot of our words today, like matter, matrix, marriage, mate, mother, and mathematics and measure come out of the word root for the goddess. Because what has been suppressed in our society is the connection between science and these ancient cults. We tend to look at technology as something of a very modern discovery. It is not. There's a very important tie-in between the goddess tradition and numeration and mathematics and cosmology and astronomy. And I go into that in my other classes in the Bay Area. We talk about that. It's a very interesting concept. But again, to more familiarize people, here's a well-known painting by Botticelli, for instance, which shows Venus rising out of the scallop shell. And I'll just give a little analysis of this to show exactly how these kinds of symbols are concealed. The scallop shell has been, from time immemorial, a symbol not of the shell, but of the sun. That's why above Georgian doorways, you'll find what looks like a scallop shell motif in beautiful architecture over a window, because the the scallop shell symbolism looks like a sun ray. It was a covert or a cryptic symbol. And if you look at Shell gas stations today, if you take a second look at a Shell gas station, what you thought was a shell, just look at it again and you'll find that it is actually a rising sun. That's why it's on a red background and it's yellow. Yeah, and so again, somebody in the corporate world, these designers, know something that the ancients knew. So this famous symbol that everyone loves of Venus rising from the scallop shell is really a picture of something happening in the heavens. It's really what astrologers call a conjunction between the planet Venus, which was connected to love and beauty and grace, and the sun, which is connected to majesty and dynamism. So what that picture actually is, and how your unconscious mind registers it, is as a Sabian or a astrological motif. Your conscious mind sees it as a beautiful picture painted by Botticelli in the Renaissance, but the man was a high initiate into these brotherhoods, and he knew how to work on your unconscious and touch deeply those racial memories. And then when we look into the stellar cult again, we find a very interesting subject of etymology. The study of word roots reveals an awful lot of information that has been suppressed from us. The word mystery, the Christians and the religions of the world are always telling us that there's a big mystery out there, and that if you just wait and do your homework and say your prayers, we will reveal that mystery to you when we see fit to do so. Of course, if you write us a check, maybe we'll even hurry the process up and so on. But the idea being that religion says that there's a mystery and, we will impart that to you. But what the one mystery they don't explain is what the word mystery means. The word mystery is Egyptian. It comes from the word mista, which means woman or female. So again, we have this connection to the goddess tradition. In fact, the word mista or mesta it also gives us the word mess or mass. The Christian mass, M-A-S-S, actually comes from the word for the female. And that's why when you were given the little round wafer, putting into your mouth, that was done thousands of years before on the banks of the Nile in the great temples of initiation there. And the round circlet, the round wafer, white wafer, represented the female ovum, which was the cauldron of all life. So the bread and the Christian idea of the Eucharist all go back to these, they would say pagan motifs, but of course we know something now that's different. And then coming to the other most important cult, which we actually are still very much in today, was the solar cult. And the eagle on the dollar bill and the symbol of the eagle, this is one of their great symbols. It's not the only one, but it's one of the most important symbols that they use. And you will see it on the dollar bill, and you'll see it in Egyptian art, the sign of the eagle. And it connects to the falcon god Horus, you see. And that's why we even say the word horizon today, by the way. When the sun would be rising on the eastern horizon, we would say, oh, Horus has risen upon his zone.
Horus risen.
Yeah.
Horizon.
Yeah, he's on his zone. So the zone of Horus we now call the horizon. And the word Horus is spelled H-O-R-U-S. So when people in the ancient world used to ask, where's the sun now? What is the position of the sun? Or where is Horus, the golden falcon? They would say, what Horus, or what Horus of the day is it? We just say, what hour of the day is it? Because the word hour is spelled H-O-U-R-S.
Hour.
Just two letters that just interchanged.
Now Horus had the symbol of a full circle.
Yes, the full
Isis
sun.
has a full circle with horns around it.
Right.
And so the full circle is sun, but if it's surrounded by a crescent, then it's moon.
Yes, and that represents a very important concept in Egypt, which was taught there. And you've hit on something very important, in fact, because the secret of all theology, the secret of all religion, in fact, the secret of all mystical practice or magic is the concept of androgyny. Androgyny. Now, that is not so much on the genital level, sexually. It's about a mystical state where the male and the female, the polar opposites within you, are totally united. And no one can understand any of the sacred symbolism coming out of the ancient world, or any of the symbolism coming out of religion, if they don't understand this concept of androgyny. Why do the priests wear the flowing robe in the first place? Why do the priests refer to the church as Holy Mother Church? There's this concept right before our eyes. When you walk into a church, you walk through a door that is shaped like the female vagina or the womb. You're entering into the place that they call the most holy. So many of these euphemisms and symbols and the wafer, the whole idea of sitting for the Eucharist, is a connection to the female mysteries. Now you see, what has happened in our religions of the world is that they keep this sequestered. They do not help us get to these mystical states. They actually prevent us from getting there. So they become exploitatory. And here is again a god connected to the solar cult, which was Osiris, a very important god, the father. And this is why we show the sun today with a face. You know, the idea of having a solar face comes out of the idea that the sun was worshipped as a god. We've seen this symbol so frequently and never questioned why that would be. And here again from the Bible, or here's a personage coming out of the ancient world called Solomon. A lot of people don't realize, and of course Solomon is a very arcane subject, and people do realize that he was the great wise one of the ancient world and so on. And of course if you spell his name with 2 syllables, you'll have Sol and Mon, which is sun and moon, by the way. Mm-hmm. But the actual right way to pronounce his name is in 3 syllables, because the man Solomon did not actually exist. The concept of the story of Solomon is based on the stars again. The word Solomon turns out to be based on 3 phonemes, or 3 syllables, Sol, Om, and On, which are the name of the sun in the 3 languages of the ancient world. Okay, Sol was in Anglo-Saxon and the Indo-Aryan languages was considered, or Sumerian, for instance, was the sun. Om is the Brahmin or the Hindu concept of the sun, and On turns out to be the Egyptian name of the sun. And in fact, the word Emmanuel that is given by certain Christians to mean Jesus, his real name, it wasn't Emmanuel at all. It was Amonael, or Om, On, and El. This is how the ancients used to work. Om, On, and El, the name of the sun in the 3 languages of the ancient world. And the Egyptians were, like I said, when we talk about Egypt, we're talking about an immense period of time. Do you know that if you add up all the ages that came after Egypt, that's the Alexandrian age that followed the decline of Egypt, move into the Grecian age, the Roman age, the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, moving straight up into the neoclassical period, you know, into the industrial age, and then up into our age of entertainment, you might want to call it. If you add all those ages together and then multiply by 3, what we call Egypt actually lasted like longer than that. Wow. So something must have been going on then. And scholars today have this habit of focusing only on the latter days of Egypt, which is the 18th, 17th, and 18th dynasty onwards. And they do this for a reason. They don't want us to look back to the golden age of the stellar cult, because there are many mysteries that would be revealed. We're in America now, and we can point out one of those mysteries is that your Statue of Liberty is actually based on this slide. That's not a very good slide, but you get the idea. The symbol that basically represents your country here, the Statue of Liberty, given by the French Freemasons to American Freemasons, actually comes from a goddess called Sechet, who is known as the goddess of the number 7. That's why there's 7 rays coming out of the headdress of Statue of Liberty. It's based on an Egyptian motif. It's done in a classical design, so people won't see that, but it's actually based on a goddess from the ancient world. So, you know, this again has tremendous meaning in our world today. Let's see if we have some other interesting slides. Yeah, and the ancient word Egypt, we know, we call Egypt Egypt, but in the ancient days actually, oh wait a minute. Yeah, Egypt in the ancient days, its real name was Chem, K-H-E-M. And this is where we get the word chemistry and alchemy from. The word chemistry and the word alchemy both have the word chem in it, because it was in Egypt that the stellar cult, knew everything there was to know about the biology of the body. They were excellent naturopaths. They were the people who understood the kingship, the divine right of kings. They came up with this idea. They were the one who believed that great mystical stories should be told in a parable and allegory fashion. They were the ones who had women in positions of authority, as I said. There was no gender dichotomy there at all. And they were the ones who really practiced the theology, which is introducing you to the supreme intelligence in the universe, taking you, the human being, up to that level through a series of initiations and so on. But you see, they also had profound knowledge of herbalism, and this is even preserved today in many of the symbols that the pharmaceutical companies use, you see. And again, they're right before our eyes, but we've failed to look at it. And then one of the other euphemisms that was used for Egypt in the ancient days, if you didn't live in Egypt, but say you lived maybe in a neighboring country, Egypt was referred to as the land of the tree and the serpent. That's what the name of Egypt was to anyone that visited it. And that's interesting because we hear about a tree and a serpent in the book of Genesis. And what we have to realize is Genesis goes back to Egypt. It's a very ancient story that is what we call a sidereal mythology going way back to the first dynasties and cults of Egypt. And the word Genesis, by the way, if you go back into etymology, it means the genes of Isis, or the generation of the goddess Isis. That's what Genesis means. That's why it's the first book of the Bible. And we get many other words. The word G-E-N, by the way, gen, actually means woman in Anglo-Saxon, and that's where we get the word queen. Queen derives from Gwen or Quen, or finally queen in the soft Anglo-Saxon, you see. And many other terms, and Guinevere, Queen Guinevere. It turns up in the Arthurian legend. Guinevere just means the fair woman or the white queen, just like on the chessboard. So the land of the tree and the serpent and the book of Genesis, and the idea of the tree. If you look into the tarot card, you're going to find the symbol of the tree of life in many of their motifs. You're going to find the tree of life mentioned in all the mythologies of the world, not just from the Bible, not just from Christianity, you see. And then talking about the medical profession, you find the tree of life, or what they call the caduceus of Hermes, is a powerful symbol coming out of the ancient world. And the Nile complexes of Egypt, they worship these great mysteries. And you still find the symbol used today. In fact, America, like I said, not only does it have more zodiacs in Washington, D.C. than anywhere else in the world, but the whole of the government and structure of America was based on the Egyptian principle. It's not by accident that you see Egyptian symbols on the dollar bill. It's not by accident that you have pyramids and obelisks all over the place. It's not by accident you have these symbols on corporate logos and so on. And the fact that people, there's been some seminal work on this, by the way. This is not something that is, poorly researched. There's a book that's just come out recently. I'd like to mention it for people who, if they are interested in this subject at all, this is certainly one they need for their library. It's called The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital. And it's by David Oveson. And this is a man who's gone to the memoirs, the actual memoirs of the Founding Fathers, their letters to one another, to the Library of Congress records. And he has exposed this and shows clearly and distinctly that the agenda was to base terrestrial architecture on sidereal, planetary, and stellar symbolism. Yeah.
Well, I know for a fact that the streets that go east of the Capitol building at angles are pointing to the rising and setting of the moon.
Oh, yes.
At minimum and maximum.
Absolutely.
Latitudes there.
Incredible.
There's a lot of street designs in Washington, D.C. Maybe it came from that same book.
It did. Well, he's just one of the few people who's worked on it. I just happen to like his book because it's so scholarly. Okay. But Jordan Maxwell has researched this for years.
Say the name of it again.
It's called The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital.
Secret Architecture.
Yeah.
Okay.
By David Oveson. If we look at this slide, I also think this is interesting. We talked about the goddess of the night sky and so on. But did you know that in the Bible, we not only have a tree of life and the Genesis story, but in the Genesis story we have the primal parents of Adam and Eve. But those two parents, their prototypes are found in Egypt again. You have the celestial or stellar mother that they called Nut, or Nuth, and then you have Jeb, the earth father, the primal parents coming out of Egypt. In fact, it was Jeb, the capital G from Jeb, the earth father, is what the Freemasons use in their capital G. It's not the only reason why they use it, but Jeb was the god of the earth. And the earth needs to be measured, in order to be in harmony on earth. And to a Mason, a Freemason, the idea of Freemasonry was that everything that is done on earth, especially in architecture, should be done based on terrestrial geometry, so that you're in harmony with everything. That not a single thing can be built where it does not appeal to the unison. It has to be in unison with the heavens. And so geometry came out of the ancient world accordingly, and that's why you will see a Masonic symbol with a compass and the rule, the symbols of geometry, and inside the big letter G, the capital letter G, our seventh letter. And it has to do with the god Jeb coming out of Egypt millennia ago.
And then number 7 again.
7 again, yeah, the sacred number 7 turning up. And we even find in modern royalty, for instance, another area that you find a great deal of this stellar symbolism is in the symbols of royalty. For instance, kings and queens, the very fact that you have the white queen sitting on the white throne and the red king goes back to the signs of Cancer and Leo. Cancer and Leo are two astrological signs where the sun reaches its highest point. And we commemorate that by the queen on the left and the king on the right. And one final point I'd like to bring out for this session is that the stellar cult, they were the longest, and basically all the later cults ripped them off. They basically stole all of their symbolism, all of their great archives of knowledge. And it turns out that the symbol that became associated with the stellar cult, because each of these cults, you see, have their own symbol, just like a corporation today is known with its logo. You know McDonald's because it has a logo, right? But the cults were pretty much the same, and the symbols that the stellar cult used was obviously the symbol of the star. That's why you see it all over the place today, because as Jordan Maxwell has proved, these cults are far from being relics of the past. But the symbol that was also used, and on this slide you'll see a picture of that, is the serpent. The symbol of the serpent was the symbol of the stellar cult. And that is why you have, for instance, in Ireland, St. Patrick coming down from the high mountain. He's a Christian, right? The Christian coming to Ireland and saying, "I am casting out all of the snakes or the serpents from Ireland." And everybody wondering what on earth that meant. Of course, it doesn't make any sense until you realize it's a euphemism for something else. He is talking about the stellar cult that existed in Ireland. They existed throughout the whole world. As I said, you find these cults all over the world. Now, the stellar cult was very, very powerful in Ireland. They're the ones responsible for building the great monuments of power there. And when the Christian hegemony came along, their representative, that is St. Patrick, says, "I am casting out the serpents." That is a euphemism. It is a political jargon. It means that now there's a new game in town, and the previous cults are all ended with, you see. They're gone. And the serpent. And that's why you have Christ, for instance, mentioning the fact to his disciples, when he's remonstrating with his disciples, he even says to them, "Be ye as wise as serpents." Be ye as wise as serpents? What is that a reference to? Again, it's a reference to the serpent cult, the ones who were the keepers of wisdom in the ancient world, the ones that everyone who lived in those days knew were the great keepers, the great magi. Jesus was visited by 3 of them himself at his own birth. So this leitmotif that keeps appearing, and you'll see this very famous symbol if you look at this slide. It shows the great wings and the symbol of the sun and the cobras, you see. Those 2 cobras, this beloved symbol that we see a lot, represents the stellar cult, who were known as the serpent. And of course in Christianity then we find the demonization of the serpent, you see, and the slaying of the serpent. It becomes all important. And again, it's not about real serpents, it's about people. It's about a race of people. The serpent cult turns up in the Vikings, who used to have their boats shaped like a great dragon or a serpent, just because they were serpent cults. They also used to wear the horned headdresses, you see. So many of the symbols that we find come out of just these 4 power cults of the ancient world. And one thing that happened is when the solar cult came along, we not only see the denigration of women and the removal of them from any office of theology, but we see the inflation of the male archetype. In fact, when we read about Solomon or David or Joseph or Jacob or Abraham or Jesus, you see all the great male patriarchs of the Bible, you basically know you're talking right away about a solar cult. And our media, of course, today is fixated on the idea of the alpha male, this idea of the alpha male. And the alpha male idea, or the idea of identifying God with a male, comes from the solar cult and the Saturnian cult. And with that idea, this was when was born the idea, completely foreign to the Egyptians, that there was a heaven and a hell, that there was a good place and a bad place, that there was these opposites. Because the Egyptians just they didn't even have a word in their whole language for sin. The Egyptians had no word for sin. And they had no understanding of this idea of the concept of the punishment, for your good deeds by going to heaven, or this abominable place called hell. These dialectics actually come in with the solar cult. And the idea coming through the Christian idea is, of course, that the serpents are negative, and you have St. George and the dragon, the great hero, killing the serpent, killing the dragon, slaying the dragon, you see. All of this is propaganda. It has nothing to do with the religion whatsoever. And then finally you get the demonization and the making of Satan, the concept of Satan coming out of the Christian religion, which has caused so much toxicity throughout our world, this idea of the devil. But see, the thing that they forget to tell you is that they did demonize the horned ones, or the pagan gods. They successfully demonized the horned god. Remember we said that the horns were the symbol of the lunar or the stellar cult. Mm-hmm. But the thing they forgot to doctor was the name God. It turns out that the word that we still use for deity, that is God, G-O-D, comes from the Anglo-Saxon got, G-O-T-T, which actually means goat.
Which has horns. Which has horns.
So, they'll be telling you that they don't worship the horned one, and then you'll say, who do they worship? And they go, God. Well, they haven't done their homework properly, and you get into all of these sorts of convoluted problems then, isn't it? And of course the Garden of Eden story, this wonderful tale coming out of the Egyptian sidereal epoch, finally they doctored that, and they made the woman, the female, responsible for being cast out of paradise and leading us all into perdition and so on. Because remember Genesis, going back to Isis, the strength of the female. The males, you see, the solar cult males were threatened by the power of the female. They were threatened because they realized that the ability that the woman has to give birth to a child likens her to God. Mm-hmm. This creative idea puts her closer to divinity than it does to man. So they had to come up with something. And they came up with, one part of it was to, of course, sequester the female, and to act like God himself, or to compete subliminally with the power of the female. Man came up with what we know today as technology. Technology is nothing but man's way of competing with the creative power of the female that he is frightened of or he gets threatened by. So there's the tie, for today's technology. People need to realize this, that many symbols, that's why, for instance, Apple computers has the apple with a bite out of it. This is a symbol found in corporate America that comes straight out of the book of Genesis, the forbidden fruit. Mm-hmm. So if people open their eyes, they're going to find out a lot of this ancient symbolism turns up all over the place in the most unlikely of areas.
Buy this and you'll get knowledge.
Yes, and it comes to you at a price, you see. This knowledge is that the gender wars continue, the class war, and many people that I teach in the society about this, they come away not only symbol literate, but they find out what a kind of piece of propaganda work has been done on them, and how the mistreatment of women and children and other classes and races has been going on under the guise of religion. Because, as I said, in the previous cults, there was a tremendous equilibrium and harmony between the sexes. And then down and through Christianity, we find the image of the femme fatale, or Delilah severing the head of the alpha male, this denigration of the female, which is so all-pervasive. Then by the time the Greeks got hold of it, they kind of didn't know what to do with it. They liked some of the sacred motifs, but then they also wanted to put a lot of their own erotic and paganistic ideas onto it, and then we inherited from them. Most of our mythologies we inherit from the Greeks, unfortunately. If we could only look back. Now here's the last point that I'd like to bring out, is that we talked about the 4 great cults. It turns out that these 4 cults decided, as I said, instead of losing resources and fighting amongst one another, to get together, to pool their resources. And this actually took several centuries to happen, and most of the books of the Bible refer to it euphemistically. Many euphemisms you'll read in the Bible that seem very cryptic are actually about this. One of the references to it is the 7 churches. You may hear a reference in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, to the 7 great churches. Mm-hmm. Well, since Christianity hadn't even been in the world, how could there be 7 churches? 7 churches is a euphemism to do with the 7 great cults. But the 4 great cults, the ones of great power, decided to join up. And as this slide shows, the place of their joining up we know as Israel. And that's why Israel is called Israel, because it's made up of 3 syllables, right? And they represent the gods of the 3 cults. Israel is made up of Isis, Ra, and El. Isis for the goddess of the moon and the priestesses of the lunar cult. Ra is the ancient name of the sun, Amen-Ra. And El, as I said, it was the cult of Saturn. And that when they came together, they wanted to commemorate this. And so they gave it a name. And the place of the coming together is Israel. But for our purposes, we know, is it not true, that Israel is the place, the seed ground of the launching of what? Is Judeo-Christianity. Mm-hmm. So the point that we're making in this program is that if anyone wants to understand the roots, the origins of Judeo-Christianity, and as a Gnostic, I certainly wanted to know that, and I find that, as I said, people in the Bay Area have not completely turned off their minds. They are still very interested in discovering their cultural roots. Judeo-Christianity, all of the theologies of the world, they're founded upon something else. It comes out of the Holy Land, because at the period of AD, crossing the BC crossing to AD, the period that we identify with the birth of Christ and Christianity, actually something else was going on then. Great power cults were coming together, and they were coming together for an agenda, and we are living that agenda out now. We just don't know it. But their symbols are still all pervasive in our society. And that is why Israel bears the name that it does, and why Judeo-Christianity is so filled, replete with all of the symbols. That's why royalty has it, and that's why we even find it in the corporate arena as well.
And what about the symbolism of Jesus being a carpenter? Does that enter into all of this?
Good point. In fact, yes, because that is another euphemism. I'm glad you brought that up. Not only did they say that Jesus was a carpenter, but his father was a carpenter. The Bible is written in many codes. This has been proven even by top-level scholars. And one of the codes, we can't go into them all, but one of them is the word carpenter. It's a euphemism or a cryptic analog for the word mason. They didn't want to use the word mason because then, of course, it opens up the whole occult ball of wax. Yeah. So they covered it up by saying that Jesus was born of a carpenter. The carpenters, and of course in those days you didn't just switch trades like we do today. Your trade was your race, who you were. And it happens to be a fact that the carpenters of the, if you're talking to a Freemason, they will know what the word carpenter means. They will know, yes, that refers to one of our own brotherhood, one of the guilds who are the great carpenters. And so Christ was not born of a humble carpenter. He was born of a Freemasonic family. He was a very noble being who had he was born into esoteric traditions, and he had a school of learning, a metaphysical. This has been proven. And he was a astrologer, a magi. The whole euphemism of being a shepherd of my people. Did you know that the Pharaoh in Egypt was called the shepherd of his people, and he used to hold the symbol of the crook, right, which then you find the Pope using today. And the idea of being the shepherd of his people, the shepherds who watch their flocks by night, by the way, is another euphemism for the astrologers. Stars in the sky were always called the flocks by night. And the watchers, the shepherds who watched their flocks by night, were the great magi who even used what we look like, the crozier or the crook. You see the Pope using his crozier. That can be seen in Egypt. Yeah, so when Jesus then called a carpenter, these mean things. And the Bible is loaded with them, and I'm certain we're going to, elaborate on a future program about more of these things. And I teach this extensively in my classes, and people are just overwhelmed with interest. They realize that the time has come now for them to know this. It's not about lambasting Christianity or degrading any religion. It's about going back to its occult roots. Any architect
understanding, but it doesn't change the meaning of that particular religion or philosophy.
In fact, it enhances it. It finally tells you what all of the surrealistic, abstract, the Bible has been called the greatest abstract art book in the world, and it is until you have the code. And as I said, many other scholars in previous ages would maybe only mention this anecdotally. They couldn't go into it for certain reasons because of the weight that was being put on them from the universities and so on. But you see today, people are freeing themselves from these chains. They know they've got nothing to lose but their chains. That from the pulpit they have not been learning theology, they've been learning propaganda. And the time has to come to revisit the roots with an open and intelligent mind, to open your eyes, to be educated, and to actually empower yourself to find out what the origin of all of these religions are.
Okay, well, pretty soon we're going to have your address where people can contact you if they're interested in your courses or any of your seminars that you give throughout the Bay Area. As a scientist myself, knowing a lot about science, knowing a lot about religion, I've wanted to put these two things together and merge them myself. And one of the stumbling blocks that I've discovered seems to be the Quran, wherein it states that civilization did not exist between something like 2500 BC. And since if you're a person living in Egypt, you are Muslim and you believe in the Quran. Therefore, the pyramids are only 2500 BC years old, and all of that great Egyptian culture did not exist before 2500 BC, which I believe is untrue. That was glorious way before that.
It goes way back to the pre-Diluvian period. But all modern science and modern academics and a lot of the historians have had a tremendous vested interest. A lot of them have been under royal patronage or some other form of aristocratic patronage, and it's been extremely important for these people to not help us look back. But I specialize in out-of-print books and ancient scripts, and I've been able to do the homework. I started in Ireland, but and on my website we have extensive information, by the way, about the Astro-Theology, because it will sound controversial to people in the beginning, but they need to do their homework. And the website has been made available to them for that, and I appreciate their comments. They can always call me on some points that they're not clear of, or attend any of the talks that I do. We just did an article in the Psychic Reader, which is a newspaper that goes out, and there's a wonderful 3-page article on Astro-Theology there. People might want to also pick that up. It's a free magazine,
Okay, well, here I sit, being a person. My name's Patrick. I'm a Leo. I'm wearing black and white, which is a sign of a Saturnian cult.
Yes, exactly.
Saturnian cult, and I have a son named Matthew, which comes from Ma'at. So I think I better come to some of these classes and figure myself out.
Yes, our names, numbers, symbols, our language, even our language and our etymology is filled with these euphemisms. The names we give our children, like young star, or youngster, is an example. You're going to find this kind of thing creeping up all over society. And it helps us to understand the world in which we live, you know.
Well, this is a fascinating topic. Again, this is called Astro-Theology or Sidereal Mythology, but I think it's understanding symbology.
Yes, it is. I mean, many of the things we do when we're children, like playing hopscotch, or like, you know, putting candles on a cake and you cut them into geometrical segments, that represents the zodiac.
12.
Yeah, and a little candle for each year of your life. When you play snakes and ladders, that comes out of the stellar cult.
Oh, I forgot about
when you toss coins into water, that comes out of divination and the tarot. When you get knighted, you know, the queen knights you. Many of the things that we do, walking on the red carpet, you know, cutting the red tape, many of these symbols go back to the ancient world. And, you know, we love talking about this and sharing it with people.
And here's how you can contact Michael. Michael, let you give the information there.
Sure, Patrick. I can be contacted by email, which is preferable if you have that, at neter, that's Neter, at jps.net. Certainly check out the website that we've done. It has some incredible information there. A lot of good work has gone into that, at taroscopes.com. Or I can be reached by phone at 650-223-3304.
Very good. This is a fascinating subject, and again, this doesn't change your beliefs in anything. This just adds to it, enriches it.
Yeah, it makes you, see, we are basically, like we said in the last program, priests and priestesses of our own. We've been giving our authority away a lot, you know, and we need to realize that we are our own authority, and we can become our own theologians.
And you can do that more by watching further episodes of this topic on technology trends. You can reach us here at Post Office Box 487 in Mountain View, California, Box 487, Mountain View, California, 94042. And please tell your friends about this program if you are interested. This is part of a series, I'm sure, that will be coming on, and this is extremely exciting, very fascinating.
Yeah, this is an endless subject, you know, and I'm glad that, like, it's because of the exposure, people are so interested, like yourself, and programs like this, that the message is getting out there.
And it goes all the way from tarot cards to astrology to symbols on the dollar bill.
Yeah, and into technology and government as well.
Website logos.
Yeah, because like I said, we are very modern. We're in the modern world. Our modern world is based upon many ancient things going back millennia. It's in our racial memory, and you can't abolish it any more than you can abolish dreaming at night.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Michael, and we'll see you next time on Technology Trends.
Thank you, Patrick.